The wind came off the channel in gusts, carrying the smell of salt and something older, concrete, damp stone, the slow rot of sandbags. A German soldier stood at his post in a coastal bunker somewhere above the beaches of Normandy. It was the hour before dawn on June 6, 1944. The sea below him was gray and restless. He had stood this watch 100 times. Nothing had ever happened. Then the sound began, not from any particular direction, from everywhere. A low, grinding roar that built and built until the concrete beneath his boots seemed to vibrate with it. He turned north. He turned east. He turned west. And then the first gray light broke along the horizon. He saw it. The horizon was not visible. It was ships. 600 meters to the south, in a house in the town of Irretrievable, the commander responsible for defending this coastline was asleep. On the road to Rennes, the division commanders charged with holding this sector were climbing into their staff cars for a war game exercise. At their assembly areas in the woods of northern France, 4 of the most powerful Panzer divisions in the Wehrmacht sat idle, engines cold, waiting for permission that had not come. One German general did hear the Allied aircraft and turned his car around. He raced back to his headquarters and pulled onto the grounds. He ran directly into American paratroopers. His name was General Wilhelm Falle, and he was the first German general to die in Normandy. He had been dead for an hour before most of his colleagues knew the invasion had begun. This is not a story of Allied triumph. This is something darker. The story of how Germany lost the most consequential battle of the Western Front before the Allies had fired a single shot. And at the center of that story are the Canadian soldiers who stormed Juno Beach, who broke through faster than any other Allied force, and who, by doing so, exposed every structural failure in the German command. By late May, 58 German divisions were stretched across 2,000 kilometers of European coastline from Norway to the Spanish border. On paper, that was formidable. On the ground, it was a different calculation. Many of those troops were Osttruppen, conscripts drawn from Soviet prisoner camps, Turkestani and Mongolian soldiers equipped with captured weapons they had been given no time to master. German soldiers now averaged 6 years older than their Allied counterparts. The Atlantic Wall that Hitler had promised, 15,000 emplacements manned by 300,000 troops, existed mostly on maps. Shortages of concrete and labor had gutted the construction program. Only at the Pas de Calais was there anything approaching a continuous belt of defenses. Everywhere else, the wall was gaps held together by confidence. The weapon that could compensate for all of this was armor. 10 Panzer divisions in France and the Low Countries. If they could reach the beaches in the first hours of a landing, before the Allies had men and vehicles enough ashore to build a real perimeter, they could do what infantry and concrete could not: push the landing back into the sea. Every senior German commander understood this. What they could not agree on was how to use it. Erwin Rommel was the most famous German officer of the war, commander of Army Group B, responsible for the defense of the northern coast. He had made his reputation in the tank battles of North Africa, and he had drawn one hard lesson from that experience: Allied air power. In France, as in Libya, the sky belonged to the enemy. Any panzer force held in reserve would be pounded on its approach roads before it reached the front. The tanks had to be at the beaches before the landings came deployed close enough to strike within the first hour, because after the first hour they would not be able to move in daylight. Gerd von Rundstedt disagreed. Commander-in-Chief West, 68 years old, a Prussian aristocrat who privately called Hitler the Corporal. Von Rundstedt wanted a concentrated reserve, grouped centrally, ready to deliver a decisive blow once the actual landing location was confirmed. He had seen what happened at Salerno, where naval gunfire had shattered German armored formations that pushed too close to the water. He was not going to commit his armor to a fixed beach line that Allied battleships could sweep clean. Both arguments had merit. Hitler resolved them with a compromise that satisfied neither man and broke both plans. Rommel received operational control of 3 Panzer divisions, only one of which, the 21st Panzer, sat within immediate striking distance of Normandy. The 4 most powerful divisions, the 1st SS, the 12th SS Hitlerjugend, the 17th SS Panzergrenadier, and Panzerlehr, were placed in OKW Reserve, Wehrmacht Supreme Headquarters. They could not be moved by anyone without Hitler's express personal order. Germany had built a cage around its best weapon, and the question of June 6th was whether the key would arrive in time. There was another force at work on the German mind, one that had been building for months. The Germans knew the Allies were masters of deception. They feared being fooled, and that fear had been carefully fashioned into a weapon. Operation Fortitude was not simply a collection of inflatable tanks and fictitious radio traffic. It was a psychological architecture, a constructed reality that told Germany's high command what it already suspected, that the real invasion would come at the Pas de Calais. The shortest crossing, the most logical route, the area directly covered by Germany's most powerful formation in the West. FUSAG, the notional 1st United States Army Group, was a ghost, a radio signature, and a name. Its nominal commander was George Patton, the one American general the German High Command genuinely respected. Into this architecture, a single agent fed the machine. Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo, was a Spanish double agent operating for British intelligence. 62 of his fabricated reports had found their way into OKW intelligence summaries. His controllers trusted him absolutely. And on the morning of June 6, 1944, as Allied soldiers reached the beaches of Normandy, Garbo would send a message to his German handlers. That message was a time bomb already ticking, set to land at OKW at the exact moment the German command structure most needed a reason not to act. The deeper irony was invisible to the men it trapped. The Germans feared Allied deception so profoundly that they had trained themselves to distrust their own eyes. The more they thought about being deceived, the more they deceived themselves. The evening of June 5th was quiet along the Normandy coast. The channel was running heavy. 4- and 5-foot swells, low cloud, visibility closing down. The forecast from German meteorologists was unambiguous. No invasion in these conditions. At his headquarters near Saint-Germain-en-Laye, von Rundstedt reviewed the forecast and went to bed. At the Berghof above Berchtesgaden, Adolf Hitler took his sleeping medication after an evening with Eva Braun. At his headquarters in Rennes, General Friedrich Dollmann confirmed arrangements for the following morning's war game exercise. It was a quiet night in the German High Command. The storm had seen to that. Field Marshal Rommel packed a bag in the early afternoon. His wife Lucy turned 50 tomorrow, and he had brought her shoes from Paris. The weather was too bad for a landing. He had been pushing his headquarters hard for months. A day away would not matter. More than that, he planned to drive to Berchtesgaden the day after tomorrow to argue his case to Hitler directly. He wanted more control over the Panzer reserves, the 4 divisions locked behind OKW's wall. He believed that if he could sit across from Hitler and make the case clearly, something would change. He was going to argue for the Panzers while the Panzers sat idle. He did not know this yet. In a chateau near Saint-Lô, one officer was not leaving. General der Artillerie Erich Marx turned 53 tomorrow. He walked on a wooden prosthetic leg. His left lost to a Soviet shell in 1941. 2 of his 3 sons were dead on the Eastern Front. He had lobbied against his wife's wishes to return to frontline duty. His officers described him as a man of Spartan old Prussian simplicity. He wasted nothing, not food, not words, not time. Marx had believed for months that Normandy was the most likely landing site. He had said so up his chain of command. Nobody above him had agreed. He went to sleep on the night of June 5th with his maps and his telephone waiting. What the Germans could not know, having no weather stations in the North Atlantic, was that Allied forecaster group Captain James Stagg had detected a break in the storm. Starting at midnight, holding through June 6th. The window was there if you knew where to look. Eisenhower knew. Nobody in Heruvillet knew. Nobody at the Berghof knew. The door had been left open. Nobody inside the house was watching it. Shortly after midnight, the paratroopers fell. The American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions dropped across the Cotentin Peninsula. The British 6th Airborne dropped east of the Orne. Hundreds of dummy parachutists, some rigged with explosives to simulate ground fighting, scattered across the Normandy countryside. The phone lines cut by the French resistance were already silent. German commanders reached for phones that rang nowhere. The scale of the airborne operation, from the Cotentin to the Orne River, 50 miles of simultaneous drops, was the first signal. A feint does not look like this. Feints are small, precise, aimed at a point. This was everywhere at once. At his headquarters near Saint-Lô, Erich Marx was awake and on the telephone. He did not deliberate. He measured the arc of the reports and understood. This was the preamble to a seaborne landing. He alerted 7th Army at Le Mans. The chain rose upward through the dark. Rommel's chief of staff, General Major Hans Speidel, took the calls before 2 a.m. The chateau's corridors hummed with urgent footsteps. Rommel's chair at the command table was empty. Von Rundstedt was awake before 3 o'clock. The reports were fragmentary, confused, alarming. He worked through them with the methodical calm of a man who had been doing this for 50 years, and he reached a conclusion quickly. Airborne operations on this scale could not be a diversion. They were the prelude. Something very large was coming ashore before dawn. He contacted OKW and requested authority to move the Panzer reserves immediately toward Caen. OKW could not agree without Hitler's approval. At approximately 3 a.m., von Rundstedt acted without that approval. He ordered the 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr to move immediately toward Caen. He made the call his formal authority did not quite cover, and he made it correctly. The divisions stirred in their assembly areas, engines turning over, commanders issuing orders, the first motion toward the coast. Above them, The skies were thick with cloud, heavy overcast, the kind of ceiling that grounds Allied fighter bombers. The Panzers could move now, in this darkness, under this cloud, and reach the battle area before first light. The window was open. The window was right now. At 7:30 a.m., General Alfred Jodl at OKW called back. The two Panzer divisions could not be committed without Hitler's explicit order. Hitler had not given the order. Von Rundstedt must countermand his own instruction. The Panzers stopped. The cloud held. The window stayed open, and no one walked through it. Whether Hitler was physically asleep at that moment or simply unreachable made no practical difference. No one at OKW was willing to commit the reserves without his personal approval. His adjutants hesitated, as historian Ian Kershaw has observed, to wake him with information that might prove mistaken. His staff understood what happened to men who brought the Führer wrong news, and so the machinery of the German High Command, at the most consequential moment of the entire Western campaign, stood perfectly still and waited for permission to save itself. When Hitler finally received the news, his response was a radiant smile. It's begun at last. He attended a reception for the Hungarian Prime Minister at Salzburg that afternoon. He was not a man in the grip of panic. He was a man who had been perfectly deceived, serene in the certainty that his Atlantic wall would hold. At OKW, Garbo's message had just arrived. Normandy was a feint. His trusted source reported the real blow was still coming at Calais. Everything Hitler already believed was now confirmed by a voice he trusted. The Panzers would wait. At 7:45 in the morning, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division hit Juno Beach. What happened in the next hour would shape everything that followed, not because it was the largest landing, not because it faced the lightest defenses, but because it was the fastest. The Canadians had been preparing for this specific moment for years. They had trained for amphibious assault at a level of repetition that no other Allied force had matched. They had studied Dieppe, their own catastrophe of 1942, and had built into their doctrine every lesson that disaster had purchased at such terrible cost. Juno Beach was not the easiest assignment on June 6th. The German defenses along the Canadian sector were formidable. Concrete bunkers housing 75mm and 88mm guns, machine gun nests with interlocking fields of fire, beach obstacles designed to tear open landing craft, minefields, and wire. The initial Canadian waves took severe casualties in the surf and on the waterline. Men died before they reached dry ground. They kept moving. They used Bangalore torpedoes to breach the wire. They threw grenades into bunker-firing slits. When their supporting armor was delayed by underwater obstacles, they pushed forward without it. When machine gun fire cut down entire sections, the survivors continued the advance. And by approximately 8:22 in the morning, according to German unit reports captured by Allied intelligence later, Canadian forces had penetrated completely through the coastal defense zone and were advancing inland toward their first-day objectives. 37 minutes from landing to breakthrough, not for a raiding party, for an entire division. German defensive doctrine assumed assault forces would spend hours, possibly days, fighting through coastal defenses. The Atlantic Wall was designed to delay attackers and buy time for armored reserves to arrive and counterattack. But the Canadians had moved so fast that those reserves were still sitting in woods east of Caen, when the beachhead was already secured. By noon, Canadian forces had penetrated farther inland than any other Allied formation on D-Day. They were threatening the critical road junction at Carpiquet. They were positioned to potentially drive a wedge between German forces and block the very routes the Panzer reserves would need if they were ever released. The German command structure had failed to stop the landing. The Canadians had made certain the landing could not be stopped. In the assembly areas east of Caen, the Panzer Division sat beneath the trees, engines cold, the cloud above them unbroken. Reports arrived from the beaches. The numbers grew. The beachhead deepened with every half hour that passed. The divisions that could have advanced in darkness under that overcast 8 hours earlier were still waiting. At 2:30 p.m., Hitler's approval finally came through. The Panzer reserves were released. The morning overcast had broken up. Allied fighters and bombers ranged freely over every road in Normandy, hunting anything that moved. Panzer Lehr, when it eventually reached the front, had already lost 85 armored vehicles and 123 trucks to air attack before firing a single shot at an Allied soldier. The 4.5 hours between Hitler's refusal and his reversal were when the window closed. Not on the beaches, not in a firefight, in a phone call that never came. There was one division available. The 21st Panzer had been fighting British airborne forces since before dawn. Its units pulled in multiple directions by conflicting orders throughout the morning. It was mid-afternoon when it finally moved north toward Caen. General Erich Marx found Colonel Hermann von Oppen-Bronikowski, the officer leading the attack. The beachhead was hours old. The gap between the British and Canadian divisions was real, and the 21st Panzer was all Germany had. Marx looked at the man and said, "If you don't succeed in throwing the British into the sea, we shall have lost the war." The 21st Panzer drove north. It found the gap between the British 3rd Division and the Canadian 3rd Division. Elements pushed through and came within sight of the sea. For a moment, a genuine, vertiginous moment, it almost worked. Then the British anti-tank gunners at Perrier-sur-le-Dent opened fire, and then the sky changed. Hundreds of Allied gliders came in low over the advancing German armor, a second airborne wave flying directly overhead, landing behind the Panzer line. The German commanders below watched them fill the sky and understood, without requiring further evidence, what it meant. They were not simply stopped. They were flanked, cut off from behind by what was descending around them. The 21st Panzer Division withdrew. It had lost 70 of its 124 tanks. Germany's last realistic counterattack of June 6th ended not in a decisive tactical defeat, but in a German commander watching the sky fill with Allied aircraft and understanding in that moment what the afternoon had meant and what the morning had already decided. By nightfall, 133,000 Allied troops were ashore. Casualties numbered 10,300. The landings cost more blood than any single day's fighting in any American campaign since the Civil War. But the beachhead held across all 5 beaches. By June 30th, 850,000 men, 148,000 vehicles, 570,000 tons of supplies. The thing was built. It could not be pulled down. Erich Marx died on June 12th, 6 days after his birthday, 6 days after the invasion he had spent months anticipating. He was on the road to Carentan, moving to oversee a counterattack, when an Allied aircraft found his car. He died the same day. He had been right about Normandy. He had been at his post. He had been killed by the specific threat, Allied air power, that had defined every hour of June 6th and made the Panzer reserves unmovable in daylight. And then there is the 15th Army, Germany's most powerful formation in the West, positioned above the Pas de Calais, the force that never came to Normandy, never fired a shot at an Allied landing because it was waiting for George Patton's army to arrive. For 7 weeks after D-Day, it held its positions and watched the horizon for a blow that was never coming. Patton's army did not exist. It was a radio signature, a fictitious order of battle. 62 fabricated intelligence reports fed by a man in London into the war summaries of the German High Command. And the Ghost Army held a real army in place while real men died on real beaches. The deception kept working long after it should have been obvious. It kept working because Germany had built a command culture that was afraid to trust what its own eyes could see. Von Rundstedt put his assessment in writing in the weeks that followed. He described Allied air power as controlling not just the beaches, but every road for 200 kilometers inland. Almost unlimited in radius, he wrote, attacking uninterruptedly to destroy the railway systems, the bridges, the supply columns. He wrote it without self-pity, without excuse. He was the man who had been awake before 3 a.m. on June 6th, who had ordered the right divisions to move at the right moment, and who had spent the rest of the day waiting for a phone call that came 4.5 hours too late. The window had been open for one morning. The overcast held while the Panzers sat still, and by the time the key arrived, every road in Normandy was a killing ground, and the beaches were already won. The Canadian soldiers who hit Juno Beach at 7:45 on the morning of June 6th did not know they were breaking through in 37 minutes. They were too busy surviving to measure the clock. They knew only that the wire had to be breached, that the bunker firing slits had to be silenced, that the men beside them were dying, and the advance had to continue regardless. But their speed, that specific operational speed born from years of preparation and applied with ferocity on that specific morning, is what transformed the German defensive failure into a German catastrophe. The Panzer reserves that were held back, the command culture that could not act without permission, the deception that kept 15 German divisions watching the wrong coast. All of these structural failures only became decisive because someone hit the beach fast enough to make them irretrievable. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division did that. They were farmers and factory workers and students from across the country. Most of them had never been outside Canada before the war. They had trained on English beaches in English rain for 3 years, waiting for a morning that finally came. And when it came, they moved through the Atlantic Wall faster than anyone on either side had believed possible, and they kept moving until the thing that could not be undone was done. Germany lost Normandy because its command structure failed at every level simultaneously. The wrong reserves, the wrong doctrine, the wrong intelligence, the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong moment. But it was the Canadians who turned those failures into a verdict that could not be appealed.